The Hollywood elite gala was in full swing. Celebrities, producers, and powerful figures from across the entertainment industry filled the grand ballroom of the Regency Hotel in Los Angeles. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, the red carpet had been packed with flashing cameras, and tuxedos and evening gowns flooded the floor. Chuck Norris had been invited as a guest of honor. At 84 years old, he still walked with the confidence of a man who had seen it all. Dressed in a classic black tuxedo, he made his way through the venue with a quiet authority. Even in a room filled with A-list celebrities, he stood out not because of his fame, but because of the respect he commanded. As Chuck exchanged pleasantries with fellow guests, a voice called out from behind him, "Mr. Norris, over here." Chuck turned and saw a man standing with a camera crew, a well-known liberal journalist from one of the biggest media outlets in the country. His name was Ethan Grayson, a sharp-tongued interviewer notorious for cornering conservative celebrities with loaded questions. The microphone was already in his hand. His smirk was unmistakable. Chuck smiled politely and walked over. He had nothing to hide. "Mr. Norris," Ethan began, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear, "great to see you here tonight. I have to say, I didn't expect to see a supporter of President Trump at an event like this." The moment he said it, a few heads turned. Conversations slowed. It wasn't a direct attack, but it was a jab, meant to put Chuck on the spot. Chuck, standing relaxed, let out a small chuckle. "I'm here to celebrate cinema, Ethan," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "I didn't realize we were checking voter registrations at the door." A few guests smirked, entertained by Chuck's quick wit. Ethan, unfazed, pressed forward. "Come on now, Chuck," he continued. "You openly supported President Trump's re-election. Some would say that doesn't exactly align with Hollywood's progressive values." The air in the room grew tenser. Ethan knew exactly what he was doing, trying to make Chuck look out of place, as if he didn't belong among the so-called elite. Chuck, still completely composed, tilted his head slightly. "You mean the same Hollywood that preaches tolerance and inclusion?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or does that only apply to people who agree with you?" A few muffled chuckles spread through the crowd. Chuck's words had hit like a quiet hammer, exposing the hypocrisy without even raising his voice. Ethan Grayson, however, wasn't about to back down. His smirk faltered for eine Sekunde. "Daar fing sich schnell wieder. Awust, dass hier gewinnen must." He straightened his jacket, pretending to laugh. "Well, Chuck," he said, leaning slightly forward, "that's a clever response, but let's be real. You supported a president who tried to divide this country, a man who fueled hate and spread dangerous rhetoric." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others, clearly more aligned with Ethan, nodded in approval. The atmosphere in the Regency Hotel ballroom was beginning to shift. Some were watching for entertainment, while others were eager to see Chuck crumble. Chuck, however, remained perfectly still. He didn't flinch, didn't frown. He simply stared at Ethan for a long moment before speaking. "You know what's funny?" Chuck said, his voice steady. "For 4 years, I watched Hollywood call for unity, but the moment someone has a different opinion, suddenly they're the enemy." Ethan forced a smile, but it was clear Chuck's words had rattled him. "I'm just saying," Ethan continued, "a lot of people here tonight might find it surprising that you stand by a man like Donald Trump." Chuck chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I stand by a man who puts America first," he replied. "If that's controversial, maybe we should be asking why." The tension in the Regency Hotel ballroom was now unmistakable. Ethan Grayson had started this as a casual interview, but everyone in the room knew what it had turned into: a live ideological showdown. Chuck Norris, calm as ever, stood his ground, his eyes steady, his voice measured. Ethan, however, wasn't done. He could feel the energy shifting in the room, and he was determined to bring Chuck down a notch. He let out a small, forced chuckle, glancing around to make sure his audience was still engaged. "Chuck, come on," he said, shaking his head slightly. "America first? You really believe that? Under Trump, we saw division like never before. Protests, riots, hatred. His policies alienated minorities, tore families apart, and fueled an us versus them mentality. And yet you still stand by him?" A few nods from certain corners of the room. Some guests, clearly more left-leaning, watched Chuck carefully, waiting for him to stumble, waiting for the moment he would be forced to admit he was wrong. But Chuck Norris didn't stumble. He took a small step forward, closing the space between them just enough to show he wasn't intimidated. "Ethan," he said smoothly, his voice firm but calm, "I've been around a long time. Long enough to know that division didn't start with Trump. It started the moment one side decided they were morally superior to the other." Ethan blinked. Chuck didn't stop. "You talk about division," he continued, "but tell me who's really dividing America? The man who said, 'America first,' or the people who spent 4 years calling half the country racist, ignorant, and evil just because they voted differently?" A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Even some of the guests who had originally sided with Ethan exchanged glances. The argument was simple, but undeniably powerful. Ethan's jaw tensed slightly. His smirk wasn't quite as confident anymore. Still, he wasn't giving up. He quickly reached for another angle, desperate to regain control of the conversation. "Fine," he said. "Let's forget politics for a second. Let's talk about you. You've built an incredible legacy, Chuck, but let's be honest, Hollywood has changed. The old-school action hero persona, the tough guy with traditional values thing, it's outdated. The industry has moved forward. Do you ever feel like you don't belong here anymore?" A few guests raised their eyebrows, waiting to see how Chuck would react. For the first time, Chuck let out a real laugh. He shook his head, looking Ethan directly in the eyes. "Let me tell you something, kid," he said. "I've been in Hollywood longer than you've been alive. And the funny thing about Hollywood?" He gestured around the room. "It changes, sure. But people don't. They still want heroes. They still want real stories. And no matter how many times you try to move forward, some things never go out of style, like courage, honor, and standing up for what you believe in." Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The entire ballroom was silent. For the first time that night, Ethan Grayson didn't have an immediate response. Chuck Norris's words had landed like a hammer. The once smug reporter blinked, hesitated, his lips slightly parted as if trying to come up with a comeback, but there was none. The audience, full of Hollywood elites, wasn't sure how to react. Some clearly disapproved of Chuck's words, but others, even some who leaned left, couldn't deny the truth in what he said. The very industry that now prided itself on progress had built its foundation on characters like Chuck Norris, real men, real heroes who embodied strength, honor, and resilience. But Ethan couldn't let it go. His reputation was on the line now. He was used to dominating interviews, making conservative guests look outdated, irrelevant, or hypocritical. But tonight, Chuck wasn't playing by his rules. The smirk returned to Ethan's face, forced, slightly strained. "All right, Chuck," he said, his voice edged with fake amusement, trying to regain control. "I get it. You still think you're the tough guy, the action hero, the last of a dying breed. But let's be real, your time is up. Old Hollywood is fading. America has changed. Your kind of hero, it's not what people want anymore." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded. Some looked uncomfortable. Chuck, however, remained completely unfazed. He took a slow breath, glanced around the ballroom, then turned his gaze back to Ethan. "You think people don't want heroes anymore?" he asked, voice calm, deliberate. Ethan crossed his arms, nodding confidently. "That's right." Chuck smiled. Not a forced smile. Not a smirk. A real, knowing smile. Then he gestured around the room. "Funny," he said, "because if that were true, you wouldn't be here, trying so hard to take me down. Ethan's face twitched. Chuck continued, his voice still steady, unwavering. If Hollywood really didn't care about guys like me, you wouldn't be wasting your breath. But here you are, in front of all these people, desperate to prove I don't belong. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that the room had to lean in to listen. You don't attack what's irrelevant, Ethan. The crowd shifted. Even those who had sided with Ethan at first now looked at him differently. Chuck had turned the entire narrative against him. Ethan's cheeks reddened slightly. His smirk wavered. His voice was sharper now, more defensive. Look, Chuck, I'm just saying Hollywood is about progress. It's about moving forward. Chuck nodded slowly. Moving forward is good. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. But when you move so far forward that you forget where you came from, that's not progress. That's losing yourself. A few people clapped, not loudly, not a full round of applause, but enough to be noticed. Ethan heard it too. He clenched his jaw slightly. For the first time, he was losing control of the room. The soft claps in the room had changed everything. Ethan Grayson heard them, and he hated it. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be the one in control. He had walked into this conversation expecting to expose Chuck Norris as an outdated relic, a man who refused to evolve with the times. Instead, Chuck had turned the entire narrative against him without breaking a sweat. And worse, the room wasn't fully on Ethan's side anymore, a reporter's worst nightmare. His smirk tightened. His fingers curled around his microphone just a little bit harder. He needed to regain control fast. So he went for the oldest trick in the book. He let out a forced laugh, shaking his head. Chuck, he said, his tone dripping with artificial amusement, as if Chuck were some confused old man who just didn't get it. I gotta admit, you're a great storyteller, really, but let's not pretend you're some kind of cultural philosopher. He glanced toward the audience, flashing his signature smirk, the one he had used to make other guests crumble in the past. You made a career playing the tough guy, kicking down doors, beating up bad guys, delivering one-liners. That's great for an action movie. He paused, then he lowered his voice, sharpening it like a knife. But this isn't an action movie. This is real life. And in real life, the world has moved past people like you. Silence. The words hung in the air. A few people nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. Ethan thought he had landed the final blow. But Chuck Norris? He just smiled. Not a forced smile. Not a smirk, a real, knowing smile. He adjusted his tuxedo slightly, taking his time before responding. Then, finally he spoke. You know what's funny, Ethan? Chuck said, tilting his head slightly. I've been hearing that same line for decades. Ethan blinked. They said the world moved past. Me in the 80s, then again in the 90s, then again in the 2000s. Chuck let out a small chuckle. Yet, here we are. I'm still standing. And you're the one desperately trying to convince everyone I don't matter. A few people in the crowd smirked, some nodded ... Ethan's jaw tightened. Chuck took a step forward, not aggressively, just enough to show he wasn't backing down. And here's the real kicker, kid. His voice was calm, controlled, devastating. If I really didn't matter anymore, why are you so afraid of what I have to say? The crowd stirred. A few gasps. A couple of claps. Ethan froze. He had lost control again. Chuck wasn't fading into irrelevance. He was proving right there in that moment that he was still a force to be reckoned with. Ethan's fingers tightened around the mic. He was running out of moves. Ethan Grayson's grip on the microphone tightened. His usual tactics, mockery, loaded questions, and public shaming weren't working. Worse, he could feel the crowd slipping away from him. Chuck Norris wasn't just winning this exchange. He was destroying Ethan's credibility in front of Hollywood's elite. Ethan swallowed hard. He needed to turn this around fast. His smirk returned, but this time it was thin, strained ... All right, Chuck, he said, forcing a chuckle. "I'll give it to you. You've got a way with words, but let's talk about reality." He squared his shoulders, glancing at the audience, searching for approval. "You talk about standing up for what you believe in, but the truth is, you're outnumbered. Hollywood has changed. America has changed. And no matter how many times you talk about honor and respect, the new generation doesn't care. They see you as exactly what you are, just another outdated conservative who refuses to evolve." A few murmurs rippled through the room. Some nodded in agreement. Others stayed silent, watching Chuck. Chuck Norris didn't react immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, adjusted his tuxedo, and gave Ethan a long, thoughtful look. Then he spoke. "I'm not here to fit in, Ethan." His voice was smooth, unshaken. "I don't need Hollywood's approval. I never did." Ethan opened his mouth, but Chuck kept going. "You say I'm outnumbered? Maybe." He glanced around the room, his eyes moving over the guests, the cameras, the journalists. "Or maybe people are just too afraid to say what they really believe." A shift. A noticeable shift in the energy of the room. Chuck's voice remained steady, but his words carried weight. "The funny thing about truth, Ethan." He tilted his head slightly. "It doesn't need to be popular to be right." More murmurs. Some nods, some whispers. Ethan's jaw tightened. He could feel it happening. He was losing control. And now his frustration boiled over. His smirk disappeared. His voice lost its fake charm. He leaned forward, pointing at Chuck. "You're just bitter that Hollywood doesn't bow to you anymore," he snapped. "You can talk about truth all you want, but the reality is you're irrelevant. The world has moved on. Nobody cares about what Chuck Norris thinks." The words hung in the air. The room went silent. Chuck slowly exhaled, looking at Ethan the way a lion looks at a smaller animal making too much noise. Then he smiled, not a mocking smile. Not even a triumphant smile, just a quiet, knowing smile. And with that, he delivered the final blow. "Then why are you so desperate to silence me?" Ethan's face went pale. The audience stirred. Chuck Norris hadn't just won. He had ended the conversation. And Ethan? He had nothing left to say. A wave of silence swept through the ballroom. Ethan Grayson, once the confident, sharp-tongued journalist, now stood completely frozen. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, searching for anyone to step in and rescue him from the brutal reality that had just unfolded. But no one did. Chuck Norris's words still hung in the air like an unshakable truth. "Then why are you so desperate to silence me?" For a long, painful moment, Ethan's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Then the first clap. It came from somewhere in the back of the room, subtle but firm. Then another, and another. And suddenly, before Ethan could even comprehend what was happening, a full applause erupted. Not everyone in the ballroom clapped, but enough did. Enough to make it clear that Chuck Norris had just won completely and undeniably. Chuck didn't react. He didn't turn to bask in the applause, nor did he acknowledge his victory. He simply straightened his tuxedo, gave Ethan one last look, then turned back toward the crowd, as if nothing had happened. Ethan, however, was trembling. His face was red, not just from embarrassment, but from pure, boiling frustration. He had come here expecting to corner Chuck Norris, to humiliate him, to remind him that his time had passed. Instead, he had been publicly dismantled. The cameras had caught everything. The next morning, the headlines would be brutal. But Chuck Norris? Chuck didn't seem to care. He gave Ethan a polite nod, then walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The night continued. The gala went on, but the energy in the room had changed. Because everyone knew this was the moment Hollywood had been forced to face the truth. Chuck Norris was not irrelevant. He was timeless. And no amount of media manipulation would ever change that. Chuck Norris didn't just win that debate, He silenced Hollywood's biggest critics without even breaking a sweat. What do you think? Did Chuck handle it perfectly, or should he have gone even harder? Let us know in the comments. And if you love stories like this, hit that like button and subscribe now for more powerful showdowns and shocking moments. Make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. We've got even bigger stories coming soon. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.